Hello everybody to Sustainable River Basin Management Module 1, Part 3. We were last time looking at economic growth models, and we will be continuing on this topic a little bit more. Our current model entails an extraction, production, consumption, and a waste cycle. It always requires an input of materials that have to be extracted from somewhere and an energy input. You can imagine a similar cycle just on top of this, an extraction, production, consumption, and waste cycle. And this goes from a production cycle where emissions take place, where waste is being produced, to a consumption cycle, and at each stage we have emissions to the air. We have waste streams to the soil and to water bodies. This means that our economic sphere is entirely resting on our environmental sphere, and it's interconnected with circles which work in a similar way. So what is our way out right now to such economic growth models? Let's call it an improved economic growth model. So we have the same cycle. We're still resting, our economy is resting on environmental resources, on resource availability. We still need a material and energy input to keep our circle moving from extraction, production, consumption to waste. But we have added another circle where we try to do reuse, recovery, and recycling, where we reduce the amount of emissions, we reduce the amount of waste, and we try to make this waste available as a resource again. This is, as you can see, the overall concept has not changed. It is something that has to be considered as an adjustment, but it does not change the roots of the entire system. So it is something that still will not be sustainable at the long run. Looking at the system's life cycle from what we have just seen now, it entails technology inputs where we can drive changes. We can opt for resource efficiency, we can do conservation measurements, we can improve our technologies and change this, we can influence this. It always goes along with an environmental impact, and that environmental impact in many of the cases will be a negative impact. It also results in population growth. It influences our population number in a positive way by increasing numbers. And by increasing population numbers, we also increase poverty. So this is what we see as economic growth right now. It's our system in which we live right now. But taking all this together, any type of growth in all these components will eventually lead to an environmental collapse, because all of them draw from the environment as a resource base. So this is where changes have to take place, major changes in systems. And this is what we will briefly touch upon right now. Let's look at systems or at growth theories. One of them was produced by Lewis in 1954. You should read this article yourself, where development pattern of economies are characterized by the changing patterns of economic activities. And what is meant by this is briefly listed here, that in a first stage of development, societies would concentrate resources in primary sectors, and primary sectors would be the extraction industries, mineral mining, and agriculture. It could be forestry-based, it could be some wildlife-based extraction, and this is to essentially satisfy necessary consumption. And then there will be a second stage following this first one, which would be a switch of the economy to secondary sectors. And secondary sector would be any type of processing, value-adding, manufacturing. This is to satisfy basic needs, and is based on the concentration of consumption goods. So there's a shift already. And then we see in more developed civilizations or societies a move from secondary to tertiary sectors. And what is meant by tertiary sectors are services. Those are usually characterized by a much lower level of pollution. And well, this can take place by improving technologies again, or by simply shifting pollution to other sectors, or shifting pollution to other continents or other countries. So those is a very generic way, and we can look at this, see that development pattern in water use also. And that's what I want to show you here. A typical high-income country versus a typical low and middle-income country shown here. And the major water use categories. So we have in a high-income country usually about 59% water use for industry. We have about 30% for agriculture, and then we have about 11% for domestic use. And in a low and middle-income country, agriculture would be dominating by around 82%, and followed by industries around 10%, and domestic at around 8%. So this is generic across the globe. Now let's look at two extremes. On one hand side, India, where we have about 87% of water use in agriculture, concentrated about 8% in industry, and 5% in domestic use. And the other extreme, Germany, where we have about 80% of water use concentrated in services, about 13% or 14% in industries, and about 6% in other uses. And other uses would be agriculture, for instance. So industries have service sectors have become the major user of water here. So that is a typical stage 3 country, whereas in the case of India, you could call it's a country that would be in stage 1 or 2 if you follow this economic growth model of Lewis. Now, just summing up what we have been listening to from the beginning, what is probably a phrase quite appropriate is stated in Meadow et al. Limits to growth. The next revolution would be sustainability. So it really requires a major change in systems, which we could call a revolution. Let's keep this in mind. Now let's just go back to the history of sustainability. Where does it come from? Why did we end up in such a course, and why do we talk about sustainability? The term originated in Europe, actually in forest management, because at the time mining was taking up almost all timber, all the forests were gone at the time, and which created a crisis situation. And at that point, the term sustainability or sustainable use was termed. This was around 1713. And the first definition, if we want to call it like this, of sustainability was spelled out and documented at that time, which essentially corresponds to what we have heard from the report, the Brundtland report earlier. So this already looks at not just giving somebody a benefit today, allowing that person or society make a profit today, but allow future generations to earn at least the same benefits from it. So this was with regard to timber production and forest management at that time. Now, we can look at the development of the sustainability concept, and this starts around the beginning of the 20th century with the conservation movement and the so-called place-based preservation. At that time, many protected areas were created, forest reserves were created, and this was when people started realizing that by trying to tame wilderness, we actually caused destruction. This was later followed in the 1950s only by the development of environmental laws and institutions. And this was especially, you remember the 1950s as the beginning of oil extraction, change of our economy to an oil-based, a carbon-based economy, and the population growth and industrial revolution taking place. This was when we realized that chemical and physical agents from these industrial developments would be released into the environment and be potentially harmful for us. And only in the 1970s, something that can be already called sustainability movement took shape or started to take shape. And this was when we started to realize that the ability of the Earth's ecosystems to provide for future generations would be compromised due to population growth and consumption. This generated many discussions on global warming and so on. And in around the 2010s, discussions took shape on degrowth and the decoupling of human prosperity from environmental resource degradation. So this is a movement that started at that time and is now taking off and will be influencing, also is already influencing political decisions, and will influence also approaches to how economies work, how educational systems will transmit new findings and so on. So we will come back to this in a while. So what are alternatives to our current economic models? And we will briefly dive into the term green economy here, just to get a sense of what is meant by this. Let us recap. The prevailing model of economic growth is based on consumption of natural resources and the emission of pollutants, of our waste, into the so-called sinks. And we have realized that this cannot be sustained in any way in a world that has only finite resources and has only a finite ecosystem capacity. So that is something we have realized. Now, what can be done? First of all, there are two targets that can be changed. One is the economy has to find ways to increase prosperity without increasing resource use and environmental impacts. So now this changes the focus from consumption, as it is right now, to prosperity. And we will be coming back to this term waste times later. So economical development should not be linked to an increased consumption, but to improvements in prosperity and living quality. And the second target is to adjust our use, our interaction with our environment to the existing ecosystem resilience or the carrying capacity, and we should know what the trends and limits of these natural systems are. Now, what do we mean by decoupling of the economy from environmental impacts? And there are very good articles that you can read yourself cited here. It essentially means that we have to decouple entirely the economic growth and the production of goods and from environmental impacts. So this is a major challenge, and this needs a lot of research in material science, in politics or political science, and social economic science, not only in engineering and technologies. So what we mean by absolute decoupling, that occurs when environmentally relevant variables are stable and decreasing, while the economy may stabilize or economy may continue to grow. So this sounds very fancy, but system changes are already discussed or analyzed in scientific fora, and also are feeding into political agendas as well. Now, one of the concepts which has taken shape already is the so-called cradle-to-cradle concept, and it is actually at the same time a product certification, which states essentially that there is no zero waste. In nature, it is not possible because our Earth is a closed system, and any matter, any materials and energies can simply only be transformed. We cannot create new material or new energy, additional energy out of our system. So there's a constant transformation, and what is a waste to one becomes an input or a source of food for the other. So what we have to understand is that our product life cycles have to be viewed as an environmental balance. So it should be not a linear source to sink relationship, but a balance that should be equal on both sides. Now let's look at an example, and we take the example from this cradle-to-cradle. It's actually a company that expressed this at the first time, but that's something that's been tried to be in the process of being implemented at a policy level right now. So what we see here are, we can differentiate our relationship with natural resources in two ways, either a biological cycle or a technical cycle, but in any way both are touching each other or are interconnected with each other. So we can analyze those cycles independently, or we can analyze them jointly and can work on each of these steps and influence them in a way that we become, we conduct environmental, we produce an environmental balance, and we make sure that resources are captured and waste is captured as a resource and made available for different production processes or different biological processes at a later stage. So this is what has been attempted in textile industry, for instance, in this specific case, but also in other technologies, in other production cases. We will stop here, and we see us again next time.